You know, have you ever stopped to think about the hidden architecture of a worldview? Take this quote from our source material. Zen attempts to stand on its own 2 feet while secretly using the furniture of a theistic room. I mean, it's a completely fascinating metaphor, right? It's basically suggesting that certain systems of thought might publicly reject a foundation while privately relying on it just to make sense of the world. Philosophers call this using borrowed capital, and it's going to be the absolute center of our explainer today.
Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be acting as impartial explorers navigating a pretty dense, highly structured academic critique. Our goal? We're unpacking a really specific, rigorous analysis of Zen Buddhist ideology. This analysis operates entirely from a Reformed Christian framework, presenting a systematic challenge to Zen's internal logic. Now, whether you personally agree with the premise or not isn't the point today. Our goal is just to understand the mechanics of the argument being presented. We're going to see exactly how this source deconstructs Zen thought, claiming that it systematically fails to support its own weight.
All right, so let's just dive right into this. We need to define two specific philosophical tools the report uses to build its critique. Think of these kind of like dual lenses and a pair of glasses. First, we have Gordon H. Clark's axiomatic logic. Clark argued that knowledge requires absolute, infallible first principles, basic truths you simply can't build without. Without this, he argues, you just end up with subjective opinion. Second, we have Cornelius Van Til's presuppositional apologetics. Van Til argues that human logic, and honestly the fact that the universe makes sense at all, requires the assumption of a Christian God as its absolute foundation. Without that specific foundation, nothing actually makes sense.
Using these lenses, the source inspects 5 key areas of the Zen worldview: knowledge, being, morality, existence, and a final synthesis.
All right, let's hit section 1, the problem of knowledge. So, you're probably familiar with this classic Zen koan. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Zen epistemology often claims that ultimate truth is, well, non-conceptual. It's supposed to be a special transmission outside of scriptures, completely independent of words, letters, and conventional logic. The koan isn't meant to be logically solved, it's meant to break your reliance on rational discursive thought, basically pointing you toward a direct, unmediated experience of reality. But here's where the critique identifies what they call a massive performative contradiction. Because think about it, to state that truth is beyond language and logic is, well, it's a linguistic, logical proposition. You literally have to use language to tell someone that language doesn't work. Furthermore, to use a koan to dismantle logic, you actually have to rely on the underlying rules of classical logic just to make the paradox function in the first place. According to the source, to argue against reason, Zen is forced to sneak inside the confines of reason, making its stance structurally incoherent.
And this creates a pretty huge problem. Zen claims that awakening, satori, is a direct, non-conceptual experience, but the critique points out that this leaves Zen with zero objective criteria for verification. Like, if truth is just a nonverbal experience, how do you actually distinguish genuine enlightenment from, say, just a psychological anomaly or a subjective feeling? The argument here is that Zen effectively reduces truth to an unverifiable private state.
Which naturally leads us to what the source calls a historical contradiction, or the hypocrisy of scriptural reliance. Zen rhetorically disparages the written word, claiming it doesn't rely on scriptures. But, historically and practically speaking, the Zen tradition is absolutely saturated with sutra recitations, lineage records, the written sayings of past masters, the whole shebang. The critique argues this perfectly demonstrates the borrowed capital thesis. Zen practically relies on a text-based, authoritative mode of transmission while publicly disavowing it.
Moving on to section 2, the origin of being. The source draws a really stark contrast here between Zen's concept of shunyata, which is basically an impersonal emptiness or void, and the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing by a personal, rational God. The critique asserts that while shunyata might describe the interdependent nature of things, it isn't a causal agent. Basically, emptiness cannot create.
Which brings us to this massive, unanswered question: why is there something rather than nothing? According to Van Til's framework, an impersonal ultimate reality provides absolutely zero explanation for why we have a contingent, rational, and highly ordered cosmos. If the universe's ultimate nature is an undifferentiated flux or just an empty void, then the uniform laws of nature and our human ability to comprehend them rationally are just inexplicable arbitrary coincidences.
So the crucial point the report makes here is that this non-theistic foundation creates a severe crisis of authority. If ultimate reality is impersonal, well, there can't be any personal revelation or objective standard handed down by a creator.
A Zen master is left to just point at the truth, but they can't explicitly teach it propositionally. And without an objective external standard, the source argues, there's literally no way to authentically test these teachings. Everything just collapses back into subjective interpretation.
Next up, Section 3, the collapse of morality.
To really grasp the critique here, we just need to quickly define two Zen concepts. First is upaya, or skillful means. It's the idea that moral precepts aren't absolute rigid commands, but more like flexible, contextual tools meant to help a student awaken. Then there's anatta, the doctrine of non-self, which is the idea that there is no permanent, substantial human soul or agent.
The source contrasts this anatta doctrine directly with the imago Dei, the Christian belief that humans are created in the image of a personal, moral God. The critique argues that if you deny a permanent self, the very concept of moral responsibility just becomes incoherent. I mean, if the self is an illusion, who exactly is committing a wrong? Who is striving for enlightenment? The biblical view, by contrast, explicitly grounds moral accountability in a real agent acting before a holy God.
This leads to one of the absolute most striking conclusions in the report. It says that without a transcendent lawgiver, compassion is reduced to a preference, no more objectively binding than a desire for chocolate. Think about that. The argument here is that while Zen strongly encourages compassion and virtuous behavior, its ultimate philosophy of non-duality means the distinction between good and evil is ultimately an illusion. Ethics become purely descriptive or pragmatic, but they lack any true objective prescriptive force telling us why we absolutely must be good.
All right, entering Section 4, the void of existence. From a Clarkean perspective, the source argues that shunyata, or emptiness, completely fails as an ultimate foundation. Why? Well, because emptiness is a negative principle. It's descriptive, it's not constructive. It describes what phenomena lack, meaning they lack independent existence, but it provides absolutely no positive explanation for the existence, identity, or coherence of the universe itself. It's kind of like describing how a machine's parts interact without ever explaining who built the machine or why it's even there in the first place.
Furthermore, this extreme non-duality creates a pretty massive practical problem for Zen. If all distinctions are ultimately unreal and empty, well, then the very distinction between delusion and enlightenment has to be empty too. So the critique asks, how can there possibly be a path from one to the other? If true nature is empty of all characteristics, then centuries of disciplined meditation, koan study, and master-student relationships become, philosophically speaking, totally meaningless activities. The system basically undermines its own goal.
And finally, Section 5, synthesis, the despair of autonomy.
So across all four of these domains, epistemology, theology, morality, and ontology, the source basically argues that Zen systematically fails to provide a self-sustaining foundation. In every single category, the attempt to build an autonomous system without a personal rational creator results in either internal contradiction or just a total collapse of objective meaning.
Which brings us right back to Van Til's central thesis from the beginning. To deny the ground is to lose the ground beneath one's feet. The report ultimately concludes that Zen just cannot consistently live out its own philosophy. It attempts to build a house using logic, language, moral agency, and rational communication, materials that, according to the source, can only genuinely belong to the building site of a Christian worldview. It borrows the capital while denying the bank.
Now, I do think it's important to quickly acknowledge that this isn't just some casual observation. The dense academic bibliography driving this analysis represents a highly structured transcendental critique. It draws heavily on deep philosophical and theological scholarship to rigorously test the internal consistency of a worldview's ultimate commitments.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating, provocative final thought to chew on today. The source claims that all non-theistic systems are essentially just trying to build light without the sun. Now, regardless of where you personally stand on this, the critique invites all of us to carefully inspect the foundation of our own thinking. What are your ultimate commitments? And more importantly, can any autonomous worldview truly exist without borrowing light from the sun? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the architecture of thought for today's explainer. I'll catch you next time.